The morning sun rose over Iowa like a quiet promise, golden, generous, and utterly unaware of the ruins and ocean away. Behind barbed wire fences stood women who had once served a crumbling empire. Nurses, radio operators, auxiliaries of Hitler's war machine, now prisoners in a land that smelled of fresh soil instead of smoke. They had seen cities turn to ash, children starve, and nations unravel. Yet here, across the fence, they saw something that shattered everything they'd been taught to believe. Women in aprons laughing among rows of green, children picking red fruit from the earth. Food everywhere. Not out of desperation, but devotion. These were America's victory gardens, and to the German women who had survived on watery soup and despair, they seemed impossible. What they discovered in those gardens would change how they saw their captors and themselves. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with weapons, but with seeds. If this story already feels different from what you learned in school, stick around. You're about to see how ordinary people, on opposite sides of war, found humanity growing quietly between rows of beans and corn. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more true forgotten histories, and share it with someone who believes kindness can still win wars. The morning sun lifted slowly over the Iowa plains, spilling light across fields that looked endless. Wheat shimmered like water. Windmills turned lazily, slicing the quiet air into gentle rhythms of peace, unimaginable in Europe. Behind the fences, the world felt suspended between guilt and grace. The German women stood silently, gray uniforms crisp against the prairie's gold. They had crossed an ocean, yet the war still clung to their faces. Some had been nurses, some radio operators, others auxiliaries who had patched wounds or sent coded messages into chaos. All were prisoners now, branded with small white letters, PW, and an uneasy sense of disbelief. They had expected punishment, starvation, perhaps cruelty. What they found was order, routine, and an air that smelled of grass instead of gunpowder. Even the guards seemed almost bored, leaning on their rifles like farmhands. Liesl Engelman squinted toward the horizon, her eyes tracing the endless sky. The wind carried a scent unfamiliar to her, something sweet, warm, almost edible. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the last time she'd smelled anything so alive. A voice beside her, soft and uncertain, whispered, "Is that bread?" It came from Marta, a nurse from Dresden. Liesl didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed beyond the barbed wire, toward a flicker of color. Rows of green stalks shimmered in the sun. A woman in a floral apron bent down to pick something red from the earth. Nearby, a child laughed, splashing water across her shoes. Liesl's throat tightened. "No," she murmured finally, almost to herself. "It's tomatoes." The words felt foreign in her mouth, a reminder of a life she could barely remember. Food, laughter, sunlight, things that no longer belonged to her world. That summer of 1944, Europe starved beneath its own ruins. In Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, even weeds were boiled for soup. Here, across an ocean, the earth seemed to bloom out of sheer will to live. The camp looked nothing like the prisons they had imagined. Rows of wooden barracks sat neatly beside the farmland, surrounded by high fences and wooden watchtowers. From a distance, it resembled a summer camp more than captivity. The guards were young, boys, really, with polite manners and freckles that made them look harmless. They called the prisoners the ladies, a word that felt both kind and cruel in its gentleness. When they handed Liesl her uniform, they'd even smiled. One offered her coffee, real coffee, not roasted barley or burned chicory, actual coffee. The warmth of it had made her dizzy with suspicion. At night, the camp radio played Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. The sound floated across the fields, reaching even the farthest barracks. To the women, it felt like listening to another planet breathe. Days passed quietly, filled with cleaning, inventory, and long hours of nothing. The monotony itself became unsettling. No shouting, no bombings, no fear. Just too much sky and time to think. Liesl began to watch the nearby farmhouses, drawn by their ordinary rhythms. She noticed how the women tended small patches of vegetables beside their porches, gardens that grew in perfect, patient lines. One afternoon, she asked a guard, "Why do they plant food if they have stores?" The young man chuckled, squinting toward the fields. "That's a victory garden, ma'am. Everyone's got one. It keeps us fed." His casual tone struck her harder than any command. In Germany, people gardened to survive. Here, they gardened to help others. The idea lodged in her chest, strange and luminous, refusing to leave. That night, as crickets hummed beyond the wire, Liesl lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, like the world outside the fence was trying to tell her something. The mornings in Iowa began with a hush so complete it startled the women awake. No sirens, no engines groaning overhead. Only birdsong and the slow, deliberate hum of life returning each day. For the German women, the quiet was unnatural. They had lived too long with noise. The scream of bombs, the crack of glass, the distant rumble of collapsing buildings. Silence, here, felt suspicious, like a trick of mercy. Liesl often stood outside the barracks at dawn, her breath fogging in the cool air. The horizon stretched endlessly, soft and forgiving. She'd never seen so much sky that didn't smell of ash. Marta joined her most mornings, wrapping her thin arms against the chill. "It's too peaceful," she murmured once. "When it's quiet in Germany, something terrible is about to happen." Liesl nodded, unable to disagree. But here, nothing happened. The days unfolded gently. Guards passed by, tipping their hats. Trucks delivered supplies. Farmers waved from distant fields. Even the wind seemed polite, brushing past the wire with a kind of restraint. Inside the camp, small routines formed. The women mended clothes, washed dishes, peeled potatoes, and wrote imaginary letters to families they weren't sure still existed. Work dulled the ache of remembering. Food was simple but abundant. Bread, beans, stew, thick with meat. It felt almost obscene to waste crumbs, yet the guards urged them to eat more. "You'll need strength," they said, smiling like it was a kindness. At first, the women distrusted every gesture. They whispered at night. Maybe the food was poisoned, maybe this comfort was a test. But weeks passed, and no cruelty came. Only chores, meals, and sunlight. The American guards were young men from Kansas, Illinois, Ohio, places the prisoners could barely locate on a map. They talked about baseball, girlfriends, and home-cooked pie, as if war were a rumor. One evening, after dinner, the women gathered near the fence to watch the sunset. The sky bled orange and violet, stretching forever. It looked too beautiful to belong to the same world as Berlin. Liesl listened to the distant hum of a tractor, the bark of a farm dog, the laughter of unseen children. Every sound stabbed gently at her heart, reminders of what normal life once felt like. In her mind, she saw her old hospital in Hamburg, the broken windows, the patients shivering in corridors, the endless smell of disinfectant and fear. She'd forgotten that the world could smell of grass instead. When night fell, lanterns flickered across nearby farms. The glow looked like constellations scattered across the earth. "They live like this even during war?" Marta whispered. Liesl only nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Days turned into weeks. The fences felt less like walls and more like frames holding a picture she couldn't step into. Each sunrise offered peace, and each sunset reminded her she didn't belong to it. Still, something in her began to shift. When she looked beyond the wire, she no longer saw enemies. Just people planting, cooking, living. It frightened her how ordinary they were, how kind. Once a guard caught her staring at the gardens beyond the road. "You like the view?" he asked. She hesitated, then said softly, "It doesn't look like a country at war." He smiled. "That's the point." That night, Liesl lay awake, listening to the soft breathing of the women around her. For the first time since capture, she didn't dream of explosions or loss. She dreamed of sunlight on tomatoes. By morning, the dew clung to the fence like pearls. Beyond it, the earth shimmered with color and calm. And though she couldn't name it yet, Liesl felt the faint stirring of hope. Cautious, impossible, alive. The air that morning carried the scent of rain and earth, clean, generous, alive. Liesl stood by the fence, watching mist drift across the fields like ghosts that had forgotten what sorrow was. A faint clatter drew her attention. Across the road, an American woman knelt beside a small patch of soil. Her apron fluttered in the breeze, hands steady, movements practiced, tender. It wasn't farming, it was devotion. Liesl stared, unable to look away. Rows of vegetables stretched in careful lines, beans climbing, lettuce unfolding, tomatoes swelling under the sun. Every leaf shimmered as if the land itself rejoiced in being alive. Marta joined her, squinting through the wire. "Why do they grow food if they can buy it?" she whispered. The question carried more disbelief than curiosity. Liesl didn't answer. She didn't yet understand it herself. Later that day, she gathered the courage to ask a guard. He grinned, wiping sweat from his neck. "That's a victory garden, ma'am. Everyone's got one. Feeds us, helps the soldiers overseas, feeds the spirit, too." The phrase lingered in her mind long after he left, feeds the spirit. In Germany, nothing fed the spirit anymore. Even prayers felt rationed. Yet here, kindness seemed to grow like weeds, everywhere, uninvited, unstoppable. From then on, Liesl watched the gardens daily. She memorized the rhythm of life beyond the fence, watering cans tipping, shovels turning soil, laughter drifting through the fields like an unguarded melody. Sometimes a child's voice would rise above it all, bright, unbroken by fear. She'd stop whatever she was doing, close her eyes, and let that sound remind her what innocence once felt like. The American women moved with ease, their dresses dusted with soil, their faces glowing with sun and satisfaction. There was no urgency, no desperation. Every gesture seemed to say, "We choose to grow." In the barracks, Liesl spoke of it to the others. "They garden not to survive," she said softly, "but to help their soldiers." The room fell silent, her words heavy with disbelief. Ilsa, a red-haired radio operator, frowned. "In Germany, helping the soldiers means dying faster. Here it means planting carrots." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Perhaps that's why they win." That night, the thought haunted Liesl. How could a nation fight a war and still find time to nurture life? Maybe power wasn't about destruction at all. Maybe it was the refusal to stop growing. Days later, she caught sight of a woman lifting a basket brimming with vegetables. The woman's child skipped beside her, holding a single tomato like a jewel. Liesl's throat ached with something between envy and awe. The guards allowed them to trade labor for exercise outside the barracks. Each afternoon, Liesl lingered near the fence, pretending to sweep, just to be closer to that patch of earth that seemed to breathe peace. Sometimes she imagined walking barefoot across the rows, pressing her fingers into the soil, asking it how it had escaped the war. Other times, she simply watched, memorizing every color she'd forgotten existed. One evening, Marta whispered as they watched the sunset spill gold across the fields, "Do you think they know what it means to starve?" Liesl's eyes followed the distant figures moving in light. "No," she said, "but maybe they know what it means to give." The last light of day touched the fence, turning it from a symbol of captivity into something softer, a line between despair and understanding. And for the first time, Liesl felt the wire hum not with fear, but with possibility. That night, as the wind carried the scent of ripening fruit through the barracks, Liesl realized what unsettled her most. Not America's abundance, but its gentleness. Because gentleness, she thought, was the one weapon her world had forgotten. The announcement came over the camp loudspeaker just after dawn, breaking the rhythm of another quiet morning. A new work detail was forming, the guard said. Volunteers needed for farm labor outside the perimeter. For a moment, no one moved. The women exchanged wary glances, uncertain whether this was an opportunity or another form of punishment. Freedom and trickery often came dressed in the same uniform. Liesl's hand rose before she realized it. Something inside her, hunger, curiosity, or maybe restlessness, pushed it upward. Marta followed, whispering under her breath, "If we must suffer, let it at least be honest work." By mid-morning, a truck rattled to life beyond the fence. The women climbed into the open bed, gripping the rails as the prairie wind brushed against their faces. It smelled of dew, hay, and faraway cornfields. As the vehicle rolled through the gate, the fence slipped behind them, its silver wire gleaming in the sunlight. Liesl felt the faintest tremor in her chest, the fragile thrill of stepping into another world. The countryside spread endlessly before them, waves of green under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the past. For once there were no ruins, no smoke, only the hum of cicadas. The truck stopped beside a modest farmhouse surrounded by neat rows of vegetables. American women in cotton dresses worked the fields, their laughter drifting through the warm air like a hymn. A tall woman in her 40s approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're the helpers from the camp?" she asked briskly. Her tone carried authority, not cruelty. The interpreter nodded. "Then let's get started." She pointed toward a patch of tomato plants glowing red in the sunlight. "Handle them gentle," she said. "They bruise easy." The words struck Liesl strangely, a reminder that tenderness could exist even in command. Liesl knelt in the soil. It was soft, rich, forgiving beneath her fingers. She picked one tomato, then another, the scent filling her lungs with sweetness so strong it nearly brought her to tears. Around her, the other women worked quietly, their gray uniforms ghostly among the rows of green. For the first time, their labor wasn't for war or survival. It was for something living, something beautiful. A boy of about 10 followed her, offering tin cups of lemonade. When he handed one to Liesl, she hesitated. "It's just sugar and lemons," he said shyly. She took it, whispering, "Thank you." He smiled, a bright, unguarded smile that felt like sunlight itself. In that fleeting exchange, something in Liesl softened. The front line, she thought, had shifted without anyone noticing. During the midday rest, the women sat under an oak tree. The Americans shared cornbread and boiled eggs. When Marta asked softly, "Why are they kind to us?" Liesl answered, "Maybe they don't see us as enemies anymore." Work resumed, and the rhythm of labor carried them forward. The Germans and Americans moved in quiet harmony, two sides of a broken world bound by soil and sweat instead of hatred. By sunset, the fields glowed gold, and the air smelled of tomatoes, grass, and something wordless. Forgiveness, maybe. As the women climbed back onto the truck, Liesl looked at her stained hands and thought, "These are the first honest marks of peace I've ever worn." As the engine rumbled to life, the fence shimmered again in the distance, waiting for their return. Yet somehow, Liesl felt it no longer divided her from freedom, only from understanding, which now seemed closer than ever before. Morning sunlight spilled across the Carter farm like warm silk. The air smelled faintly of yeast and clover. Liesl climbed down from the truck, her boots sinking softly into soil still damp from dawn. Mrs. Carter greeted them with her usual brisk kindness. "Plenty to do today," she said, nodding toward baskets stacked by the porch. "Pick the ripe ones, not the green. Treat them like treasure, not chores." The women spread through the fields, sleeves rolled, heads bent low. The rhythmic motion of harvesting felt strangely holy. Each tomato placed in a basket felt like a small act of creation. By mid-morning, the sun grew fierce. The boy, Tommy, reappeared with his pitcher of lemonade. His cheeks were pink from running. "You ladies thirsty?" he called, mischief gleaming behind his innocent grin. Lizel took a glass, the condensation cool against her palm. The sweetness startled her. Sugar had been a memory in Germany, not a flavor. She whispered thanks, and the boy grinned wider. Nearby, Marta laughed, the sound sharp and sudden, startling even herself. "We used to trade bread for salt," she said, shaking her head. "Now lemonade just walks up to us." Mrs. Carter overheard and smiled gently. "War makes fools of fairness," she said. "But it doesn't have to make fools of kindness." Her words fell like seeds, planting something deep inside them all. At noon, the Americans laid out lunch beneath the apple trees, cornbread, boiled eggs, and thick slices of ham. "Eat," one farmer said. "Good work deserves good food." No one hesitated this time. The women ate quietly at first, shy under the weight of generosity. But soon, laughter rose. Small, awkward bursts that melted into something warm. Even the guards looked away, pretending not to smile. Ilsa leaned back against the tree trunk, chewing slowly. "We are prisoners," she murmured, "and yet I feel more human here than I did free." The others nodded, the truth too heavy for words. Later, as they packed the filled baskets, Lizel noticed Mrs. Carter humming a soft tune. Something about hope and harvest. The melody wrapped around the air like sunlight turned to sound. Lizel joined in, barely a whisper at first. The notes stumbled, but found rhythm. Soon Marta followed, then Ilsa. The Americans glanced over, surprised, then pleased. For once, there was no us or them. When work ended, Mrs. Carter handed Lizel a loaf of fresh bread wrapped in cloth. "For the ladies," she said. "Still warm." The smell alone made Lizel's throat tighten with gratitude she couldn't speak. Back at the camp, the women tore the loaf apart with reverent hands. Steam rose into the cool evening air. They ate in silence, the taste soft, rich, impossibly comforting, the flavor of mercy itself. Marta wiped her eyes and whispered, "I had forgotten that bread could be soft." Lizel smiled faintly, "And that laughter could be too." Outside, crickets sang like distant applause. That night, Lizel wrote in the corner of an old ledger she'd found. "Today we ate bread given freely. Maybe that's what freedom really tastes like." The ink bled slightly, as if the paper felt it too. Beyond the barracks, moonlight draped the gardens in silver. The world seemed briefly healed, fragile but real. And in the quiet hum of that night, the women discovered a truth stronger than any nation's war. Kindness could survive anything. When the lanterns dimmed and the camp fell to silence, Lizel lay awake, remembering laughter over lemonade, bread passed without question, and sunlight that no barbed wire could contain. For the first time, she didn't dream of escape. She dreamed of growth. The sky that morning looked uneasy, gray streaks crawling across the horizon like ink bleeding through paper. The air was heavy, swollen with the promise of rain. Still, the work continued without pause. Lizel could smell the change before it arrived. The earth grew damp beneath her knees, the wind restless. She pressed her hands into the soil, feeling the tremor of something waiting to break loose. Mrs. Carter glanced upward, squinting against the wind. "Let's finish that last row before the rain catches us," she said. Her voice carried firmness, but her eyes glimmered with excitement. Storms here were not feared. The German women moved faster, hands darting through rows of tomatoes and beans, baskets filling with the smell of ripening life. The sky darkened, thunder rumbling like a slow drum from a faraway battle. Marta looked up nervously. In Hamburg, thunder meant bombs. Lysel nodded, understanding too well. But here, the air carried no fire, only water, the kind that gives, not destroys. "This thunder feeds," she whispered. The first drops came like soft confessions. Then, without warning, the heavens opened. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking their hair, streaking their faces. Laughter broke through the chaos like sunlight hidden inside sound. Mrs. Carter didn't run. She pulled off her apron, covering a basket to protect the harvest. "Let it fall," she shouted. "God's just washing the dust off the world." Her laughter was the loudest of all. Lysel tilted her head back, letting the rain hit her face. It was cold, sharp, pure. The sensation felt like forgiveness, unexpected, cleansing, impossible to earn yet freely given. Marta spun once, her boots sinking into mud. "I can't remember the last time rain didn't mean running," she said, breathless. Lysel smiled through the downpour. "Maybe that's because we're finally standing still." The Americans and Germans worked side by side, mud streaking their arms, hair plastered to their faces. The guards shouted half-heartedly from the barn, but soon gave up, watching instead with quiet amusement. When the storm finally broke, the sky glowed pale gold, and steam rose from the drenched earth like sighs from something reborn. Everyone stood panting, dripping, laughing in disbelief. Mrs. Carter ushered them toward the barn. Inside, a fire crackled in a small stove. The air smelled of hay and smoke. Someone passed around towels and hands reached out without hesitation. Tommy, the farmer's boy, handed Lysel a towel too big for her small frame. "You work hard," he said shyly. "My dad says good people grow good food." Liesel's throat tightened. "Maybe the earth knows," she whispered. As they warmed by the fire, Mrs. Carter appeared at the doorway holding a paper bag. "Before you go," she said softly, "take this." Inside, nestled like treasure, was a single red apple. Liesel blinked. "Why?" she asked, bewildered. Mrs. Carter shrugged. "Because you looked like you needed sweetness more than the rest of us." Her smile was tender, almost maternal. Liesel couldn't speak. The truck ride back to camp was silent, except for the rain pattering on metal. The women watched the apple pass between them like a relic from another world, too bright, too kind, too real. That night, Liesel placed it on her bunk. It glowed faintly in the lamplight, a small promise against the darkness. She couldn't bring herself to eat it. Some things, she thought, aren't meant to fill the stomach. They fill the soul. As she drifted towards sleep, the rain whispered against the barracks roof, steady and soft. Beyond the fence, the fields glistened with renewal, and somewhere inside her, the first seed of forgiveness began to take root. Liesel stood in the yard, the dawn pale and uncertain. Around her, women froze mid-step, shovels hanging from their hands. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark sang, unaware the world had just changed again. Marta's voice broke the silence first, a whisper trembling like fragile glass. "It's over," she said. The words hung there, strange and heavy. No one answered. They didn't know whether to weep or breathe. The guards removed their rifles and leaned them idly against the fence. One of them muttered, "No more war, ladies." His smile was kind but nervous, as if afraid peace might vanish if spoken too loudly. Some of the women sank to the ground, their knees giving way beneath relief and confusion. Others stared blankly toward the horizon, unsure what freedom even looked like anymore. Liesel simply stood, feeling the weight of stillness. For so long, war had given them purpose, to endure, to survive, to wait. Now there was nothing left to fight against, and somehow that felt heavier than the bombs ever had. The camp changed almost overnight. Watchtowers went unmanned. Rules loosened. The fences were still there, but they no longer felt like prisons, more like boundaries drawn out of habit, not necessity. The guards grew friendlier, almost apologetic. They spoke more freely, shared cigarettes, even music. One played a harmonica near the gate each evening, the soft tune drifting across the quiet fields like a lullaby. Some women laughed for the first time in years. Others wept silently, mourning not just the dead but the selves they had lost along the way. Peace, they discovered, had its own kind of grief. Liesl couldn't bring herself to celebrate. Each sunrise reminded her that somewhere across the ocean, her home was rubble. Her mother's face, her brother's laughter, all were ghosts she couldn't summon back. When she closed her eyes, she saw the apple glowing on her bunk, the rain-soaked fields, Mrs. Carter's kindness. Those memories hurt in a way victory never could. They were proof that humanity had survived. One afternoon, she walked to the edge of the fence. Beyond it, the fields blazed gold in late summer light. The same earth that had once divided them now looked soft enough to walk across. A guard approached quietly, hands in his pockets. "You'll be going home soon," he said. The word home hit her like a stone. Home. What did that even mean anymore? That night, the women gathered in the yard. Someone had found an old radio and tuned it to an American station. Jazz filled the air, the notes fluttering like fragile flags of peace. Ilsa closed her eyes, swaying slightly. "Do you think they're dancing in Berlin?" she whispered. Marta shook her head. "No music left there." Liesl didn't speak. She only listened, letting the melody ache through her. The next morning, the guards handed out pencils and thin paper. "You can write," they said. "Letters home." The women stared at the blank pages, realizing words had forgotten where to go. Liesl wrote anyway. She didn't know who would read it, or if anyone would. "The war is over," she wrote, "but peace feels heavier than hunger." The ink smeared as she folded the paper. That evening, as dusk spread like watercolor across the fields, she walked to the fence one last time. The air smelled of grain and memory. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a world waited to be rebuilt. She wasn't sure she was ready. Autumn arrived softly on the Iowa plains. The fields burned gold under the thinning sun, and every breeze carried the scent of harvested corn. Inside the camp, time moved slower now, gentler but uncertain. The guards no longer shouted. The towers stood empty, like forgotten sentinels. The fences remained, though no one truly watched them. They were relics of another season, thin reminders that captivity still lingered in form if not in spirit. Liesl spent her days staring toward the Carter farm. From afar, she could see the apple trees turning amber, heavy with fruit. Each glimpse filled her chest with a sweet, unnameable ache. One morning, just after roll call, a truck appeared at the gate. The driver climbed down, and behind him came Mrs. Carter, carrying a wicker basket. The guards stepped aside, puzzled but respectful. She stood there, wind tugging at her shawl, eyes bright and wet. "Heard the news," she said simply. "War's over. Thought I'd bring something by." Her voice wavered on the edge of pride and sadness. When the gate opened, silence fell across the yard. The prisoners gathered, hesitant, as Mrs. Carter set the basket down. Inside were loaves of bread, jars of honey, and a mound of gleaming red apples. Marta gasped softly. "For us?" she whispered. Mrs. Carter nodded. "You helped us grow," she said. "Seems right you should share in what came of it." Her words were steady. The morning after the surrender felt strange, quieter than usual, as if even the birds were unsure how to sing in a world that no longer demanded mourning. The air held its breath. Liesl woke early, restless. The barracks felt smaller now, the air too still. She walked outside, the dew cool beneath her shoes. Beyond the fence, the fields shimmered with the glow of peace. Whispers moved through camp like soft wind. Mrs. Carter was coming. The name carried warmth, even reverence. For months, she had been their bridge to kindness, the face that reminded them compassion could survive war. When the truck arrived, the women gathered by the gate. Mrs. Carter climbed down, holding a woven basket in her arms. Her hands trembled slightly, though her smile remained steady. "I brought something for you." Inside the basket lay fresh bread, jars of honey, and apples polished to a quiet shine. The scent of yeast and fruit drifted through the fence like perfume from another life. No one spoke. The interpreter stepped forward, uncertain. What is this for?" Mrs. Carter met her eyes and said simply, "For helping us grow. It seems right that you should share what came from it." Her voice broke slightly at the last word. Liesl watched as the woman blinked hard, embarrassed by her own emotion. The simplicity of the moment felt too vast for anyone to fully bear. When the gate opened, Mrs. Carter placed the basket on the ground between them. "Take it," she whispered. "It's not charity. It's gratitude." The silence that followed was sacred, filled with understanding beyond words. Liesl knelt first, fingers brushing the crust of warm bread. The heat startled her. A living thing, real and present. She handed a piece to Marta, whose hands trembled as she accepted it. The women divided everything carefully, reverently. They ate slowly, almost ceremonially. The sweetness of honey felt foreign, overwhelming. Tears mixed with laughter, quiet and raw. For a moment, captivity tasted like homecoming. Mrs. Carter stood watching, eyes glistening. "Maybe when this is over," she said softly, "you'll plant your own gardens." Liesl looked up, the bread still in her hands. "Maybe we will," she said, her voice barely steady. When the truck finally drove away, dust rose behind it, catching the light like gold. The women stood at the gate long after it disappeared, unwilling to break the fragile spell it left behind. That night, Liesl placed one apple on her bunk, bright red, unblemished. She traced its smooth surface as if reading a story written without ink. Marta whispered, "You'll eat it?" Liesl shook her head. "Not yet." The apple glowed faintly under the lamplight, a reminder that the world beyond cruelty could still exist. Some gifts, she thought, weren't meant to be consumed. They were meant to be remembered. Days passed slowly. The fences still stood, but they no longer felt like boundaries. Guards smiled more often. Even laughter began to sound less like rebellion and more like breathing. One evening, a guard handed Liesl a folded paper. It was a letter from Mrs. Carter. The words were simple. "Thank you for showing me that kindness can cross any fence." Liesl read it twice, tears silent. The letter passed from hand to hand through the barracks. Each woman touched it gently, as if afraid the ink might vanish. In its simplicity, they found something priceless, proof that goodness leaves marks no war can erase. That night, the moon rose bright and round over the fields, reflecting off the wire like silver thread. Liesl stood at the window, whispering softly to the apple beside her. "Maybe tomorrow, I'll plant something of my own." The day they left Iowa, the sky was pale and cloudless. Trucks lined up outside the gate, engines idling softly. The women carried small satchels, their possessions few but their hearts unbearably heavy. Liesl looked back once before climbing aboard. The fields shimmered gold under the sun, calm, endless, forgiving. She could almost hear Mrs. Carter's voice in the wind, gentle as a prayer. The convoy moved slowly, the road stretching through farmland painted with morning mist. Farmers paused from their work to watch them pass, tipping their hats. No hatred, no cheers, only quiet acknowledgement. Marta murmured, They'll never know how strange it felt to be treated as human again. Liesl turned her gaze toward the passing fields. Maybe that's the point, she said. Maybe humanity shouldn't feel strange. When they reached the port, ships waited like gray ghosts against the horizon. The air smelled of salt and iron, the sea both inviting and cruel, the last threshold between two broken worlds. The freckled guard who'd once given her coffee approached with an envelope. "From Mrs. Carter," he said softly. Liesl nodded, unable to answer. Inside was a note written in careful script. "Plant something when you get home." She folded the letter gently and tucked it into her pocket. Around her, the women boarded in silence, the creak of wood and rusted metal echoing against the water. The ship groaned like an old memory. As it pulled away, Iowa's shoreline blurred into light. The women leaned against the rail, watching the land fade until it was nothing but horizon. Liesl whispered, "We left kindness behind, didn't we?" Marta answered, "No, we carry it now." Days at sea were long and cold. The night smelled of brine and loneliness. Sometimes the women shared stories of farms, gardens, bread, laughter. Each word a seed, keeping them from despair. Liesl often sat alone on deck, tracing the folded letter in her pocket. She thought of the apple still on her bunk, of red fruit glowing against gray walls. Memory, she realized, could feed you too. When they finally reached Europe, the sight that met them stole their breath. The port was half collapsed, cranes twisted like broken ribs. The city beyond was a skeleton of smoke and stone. No banners, no flags, only silence. The Red Cross met them with thin blankets and instructions spoken softly, as if words might shatter what was left of the world. Liesl felt the ground tremble beneath loss. As they walked inland, ash clung to their boots. Streets once filled with parades now echoed with hollow footsteps. Children scavenged among ruins, faces sharp with hunger. Even the air seemed exhausted. Marta stopped before a burned-out building. "This was my street," she whispered. Her hands trembled. "My house. Somewhere here." Liesl placed a hand on her shoulder. There was nothing to find, only memory buried under rubble. They found shelter in a half-destroyed church. The roof was gone, but the stone walls still stood, holding echoes of hymns that hadn't been sung in years. Inside, the silence felt almost merciful. That night, Liesl unfolded Mrs. Carter's letter again. "Plant something when you get home." She read it over and over, the words like sunlight pressed between pages. Home was gone, but soil still existed. The next morning, she found a small patch of ground near the church steps. It was gray and hard, but she knelt anyway, using her bare hands to dig. From her pocket, she drew a cloth-wrapped secret, tomato seeds from Iowa. She pressed them into the earth and whispered, "For every kindness the world forgot." Around her, the city groaned, but in that patch of soil, life stirred again, fragile, stubborn, defiant. A home was beginning to grow. Morning came gray and quiet, the kind of light that made ruins look like ghosts. Liesl stepped outside the shattered church, clutching the small patch of soil she had claimed as her beginning. The air smelled of smoke and rain, a mixture of endings and possibilities. Around her, Germany was trying to breathe again, slowly, painfully, as if remembering how to live after forgetting too long. Children moved through the rubble, collecting scraps of wood and twisted metal. Their laughter, faint but real, rose between broken walls like the first notes of a forgotten song. Liesl watched them with aching hope. She knelt by her small garden. The earth was brittle, untrusting. Still, she loosened it with her fingers, whispering softly as if coaxing a wounded animal. "Grow," she murmured. "Please, just grow." For days, nothing happened. Rain fell, then vanished. Dust settled. The other women doubted, but Liesel returned each morning, her faith stubborn as the weeds pushing through cracks in the stone. Then one dawn, she saw it. A single green shoot, thin as thread, trembling in the wind. She gasped, touching it gently. It was alive, fragile yet defiant. A miracle wrapped in dirt. She laughed then, a sound that startled even herself. Marta came running, eyes wide. "Is it real?" Liesel nodded through tears. "It's real." It remembered. The women knelt together, their breath mingling with the morning mist. Word spread quickly. Others came to see the small sprout that dared defy ruin. No one spoke loudly near it. Even soldiers passing by lowered their voices, as though in the presence of something sacred. Each day the plant grew taller, its leaves widening toward light. Liesel tended it like a prayer, water when she could, warmth when she couldn't, hope always. It became her heartbeat. Sometimes she thought of Mrs. Carter's note, "Plant something when you get home." She hadn't known then that those words would save her. Not her body, but the part of her that still believed in tomorrow. One evening she sat beside the plant as sunset bled through the clouds. The ruined city glowed briefly gold, as if remembering beauty. Liesel whispered, "Maybe peace isn't built. Maybe it's grown." When the first tomato ripened, she held it carefully in her palms. Its red skin glistened like glass. Around her the others gathered, their eyes bright with disbelief. Life had returned, soft, edible proof of hope. They divided it into thin slices, sharing each piece as if partaking in communion. The taste was sharp, sweet, and impossibly alive. Tears and laughter mingled freely, no longer enemies, but companions of survival. Soon more plants sprouted. The churchyard became a garden, rough, uneven, but alive. Passers-by began to bring seeds, bits of compost, stories of rebuilding. What had begun as memory turned into movement. Liesel often worked in silence, but sometimes she spoke to the plants as she had in Iowa. "You see?" she'd say softly. "The world still remembers how to grow." The soil answered with quiet persistence. Years later, people passing through the rebuilt town would pause at that small garden. They'd hear the story of a German nurse who planted seeds from across the ocean and refused to let them die. No plaque marked the spot, no monument stood. Just a cluster of red fruit swaying in the breeze, simple, ordinary, immortal, a reminder that peace, like a garden, must be tended every single day. And when Liesel knelt beside those plants in her final years, she often smiled through tears, whispering to the wind, "Good people grow good food." The earth, faithful and forgiving, always seemed to whisper back, "Yes."